discussion that Dr. Arthur Markman, or Art Markman, joined us for was for a very different film. It was Hitchcock's Spellbound. The two films could not be any more different. And that one is about dreams, and how psychologists first looked at dreams and how they worked. This is very much a different kind of film. So just to tell you a little bit about our guest, this is a dizzying bio that he has. I had to chop many accomplishments out of it so that people don't fall asleep or feel incredibly inadequate about their own lives. But Art Markman is a professor of psychology, HDO, which is the Human Dimensions of Organizations, and Marketing at the University of Texas at Austin, and executive director of the IC Squared Institute, which is a think and do tank. Art brings insights from cognitive science to a broader audience through his blogs at Psychology Today and Fast Company, as well as his radio show, which I'm sure many of you have heard, and podcast, Two Guys on Your Head. He's the author of several books, including Smart Thinking, Smart Change, Brain Briefs, and Bring Your Brain to Work, which is a wild concept that I should really start doing. Welcome, Dr. Art. How are you tonight?
I am doing fantastic. It is great to be here with you tonight.
Thank you for joining us yet again. We realize that your time is much more valuable than what we're paying you for tonight, because you're doing it for free, just so everybody knows. And we really, really appreciate having this level of expertise on a subject that's pretty important to all of us. Before we get into some of the questions, I wanted to sort of find out your thoughts as someone who's not only a researcher, but also a popularizer of science about the movie, about what you thought about the film.
You know, there are parts I liked and parts maybe not so much. I thought that they did a very nice job of explaining a lot of the things that social media companies are doing to really keep people engaged with sites, and the reasons for that, and the difference in the goals between the companies and the users. So I thought that was quite well done. They did have a little bit of a psychology presence in there with Jonathan Haidt, who's a very prominent social psychologist. So I liked that quite a bit. I didn't particularly resonate with some of the dramatic elements of the film, in part because I felt like they went a little overboard. Back before we got on, I was comparing it a little bit to Reefer Madness, not so much in the campiness of it, but in the kind of over the top, this is the worst case scenario of people engaging with social media, when I think the data don't quite support something quite as extreme as what they were showing.
Yeah, and there's all the sort of underscoring that builds up this sort of tension,
Yeah.
where you're looking around, is like, I'm scared, horror movie tension. I have a few questions I want to ask specifically before we start asking our audience members. And let me just sort of say, thanks to everybody who's joining us here. I see we have a number of participants, a number of folks watching along with us. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a couple of buttons for chat and for Q&A. Just as we go on, feel free to drop in your questions as we talk to Art here about this stuff. And we'll kind of go through and try to get to as many of the questions as we can get to. We're so lucky to have this expert with us. So let's use it for all it's worth. But some of the questions I wanted to ask is, so I really see social media from its advertising. Maybe it's because I'm Gen X. I see it as advertising. I just kind of primarily look at it as an advertising medium. And advertisers have always used psychological means of persuasion with varying levels of effectiveness. How is the social media model different from what came before? And how is it the same as some of those methods?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, right? I mean, I think, frankly, we have been trying to persuade people of things since there were two people, you know, and so persuasion is, I think, an inherent part of the human condition, and advertisers have been trying to find great ways of manipulating people, and a lot of the manipulation is actually not the stuff you think it is. A lot of the manipulation in advertising has to do with what you can think of as altering the natural statistics of your world. So a lot of the actions that you take on a regular basis are actions you take because you think this is normal. This is what people are supposed to do. This is the typical thing to do. So to ask yourself, for example, why does Coca-Cola need to advertise? I mean, is there a man, woman, or child on planet Earth unaware of the existence of Coca-Cola? No, everyone knows. So why do they continue to advertise? Because they want you to stare at that logo. They are brilliant. You know, those 1.5-minute ads that they have at the front end of movies are basically 90-second exercises in staring at the Coca-Cola logo as it gets passed back and forth between polar bears or a ride through a vending machine. And then oddly enough, you step up to the front of the snack line and you order a Coke because you've been staring at that logo, and it just feels like a natural and normal thing to do. And what social media does is to really amp up that change in the natural statistics of your world, in part through the actual ads that they're trying to sell you, which was a lot of the focus of the movie, whereby the longer you look at this, the more opportunities they have to slip to you an advertisement for a product or a video game or whatever it is that someone's paying to put in front of you. But they are also influencing your statistics about what you think is normal in terms of the opinions that other people have. Because they are pitching you a feed that they think is going to resonate with your prior beliefs, and so they do create a bias in your set of beliefs about how many other people in the world think similarly to you, which is not something that traditional advertisers tend to do, because traditional media don't have the degree of personalization. I mean, there are demographics that might watch a particular show or a particular station, but they can't tune it to the level of the individual the way that social media can.
So it's almost like the difference, it's the tuning, it's the difference between a sawed-off shotgun and a laser, sort of, in terms of like hitting your target. I always kind of wonder, like with Coca-Cola, how would they possibly know if they're doing it too much, if they're doing it by a factor of 100 times too much? Like, how would you ever make that determination? You just don't know.
No, I mean, they could do it potentially by trying different by actually advertising a little bit less in certain markets, and certainly I think the big companies know, for example, that if they go dark on their advertising of a particular product in a particular market for a period of time, that they do see drops in purchase. So and I've worked with some big consumer products companies, and that's data that they have. It's hard to calibrate it too much because it's a little, you're dealing with averages after that, because you really don't know exactly which people have watched which things. I mean, what social media has done extraordinarily well for advertisers is not just to be able to create a laser, but also to, in some ways, be able to carry the measurement of effectiveness to the 9th decimal place, because you actually do know exactly how long people were looking at things, how many people saw a particular ad, engaged with that ad for how long. And so it actually provides advertisers with a lot of information that they could use to answer those questions about how much is too much.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The film programmer in me wants to recommend a film right now called The Coca-Cola Kid by Dusan Makaveyev, which is exactly about how Coca-Cola deals with a market that's falling off. So I'll just drop that in.
Not to be confused with The Gods Must Be Crazy.
Yeah, which is also, there's two, there's a great double feature. Let me just write that down real quick. Okay. I would expect one of the times in the film where the scary music really comes in the most is when they talk about how social media affects children. And I wonder about that a lot, because we know that children's brains are different and they have more language receptivity and so forth when they're young. Is the effect of social media on kids' brains, is this being studied?
So there are studies. I was actually, in preparation for this today, I wanted to make sure I got some of the latest data, and it confirmed a little bit of what I thought before, which is that a lot of the studies that have been done so far are not so good, because they've been rushed out to try to do this, and they tend not to. It's actually hard to do research on kids, because it's hard to get access to them. They don't necessarily pay attention long enough to give you all the measures that you want. And so a lot of the research out there is kind of incomplete. But I'll say two things about this that I think are important. One is social media are a kind of media and we have a lot more data on the influence of media on kids. And one of the things that we know, for example, is that there are some negative influences of media on kids, in particular around issues like body image. So a lot of the research on things like eating disorders will point out that exposure to idealized body types in media can really influence kids' beliefs about what their ideal body should look like, which can ultimately lead them to eat in bad ways in order to maintain an impossible body type. And so we do know that there are effects like that will occur with magazines and newspapers, let alone social media, which can also promote some of the same effects. But if you look overall and you ask, so are social media having a negative influence on kids? Are they making kids more anxious? Is social media making kids more anxious? Is it making them more depressed? The answer is that the overall effect, if you look across lots and lots of studies, is somewhat negative, meaning that the more social media kids are using, the less psychologically good that they're feeling. But the effects are really small on average. So the average kid is not being destroyed by social media in the same way that they're not being destroyed by violent video games and lots of other things that we, every time that there's a new technology out there, we are scared. I think the printing press did this too, right? We were scared that this is the end of humanity. And generally speaking, the effects are actually pretty small.
So, and that's not just sort of the psychological effects, but in terms of even like cognitive development, the physical sort of growth of the brain and the way that everything's sort of firing. That's not a cause of great concern, at least to an expert such as yourself.
Well, I think you certainly don't want to do social media instead of homework, right? I mean, there's still some other work you need to put in, but relative to a lot of other activities, social media at least has some cognitive engagement. I mean, you're reading something and responding to something and engaging in a little bit of social interaction, which relative to old school video games where you were just playing by yourself in the basement gives you a little bit more social engagement, although modern video games are much more social than that.
Sure. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we talk about kids, but then, for a lot of people are worried about their parents, their grandparents. Many older people do seem to be, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but I would see it seems like they seem to be unable to evaluate the sort of veracity of social media materials. There seems to be a lack of an official imprimatur, and they're kind of confused. What mechanism do you think is at work there?
Yeah, so that's actually really interesting. And there's been a lot of data over the last couple of decades on difficulties that older adults have in partly distinguishing real news from fake news, but also older adults are much more likely to get caught up with scammers. The Nigerian prince who's got money for you, and things like that, and a lot of it has to do with I mean, there's several factors that intersect. One is just the way things are dressed up. I mean, I think that a lot of the cues that if you grew up in an era of newspapers and magazines, a lot of the cues you used about whether something was a legit source is what it looked like. I mean, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times look different from the tabloids and the and News of the World and the National Enquirer. And so there was a sense in which if something looked more legit, that was a way you could put your defenses down a little bit. And now, of course, we dress up lots of websites to look really official, and yet they're spewing false news. So I think that's a piece of it. I also think that as we get older, we tend to get more credulous. We tend to believe more of what people are telling us. Frankly, people are credulous in general. We have to be. Remarkably little of what we know about in the world is stuff we know about because we observed it ourselves or discovered it ourselves. Most of what we know because other people told it to us. So, for example, at the end of the day today, you're going to know more stuff about the psychology of underlying social media and social media interactions. Why? Because I told you. And you may never go and read the articles. You'll just say, I heard this guy and he said this stuff and he seemed like he knew what he was talking about. And that's we use that kind of information all the time. We have to. We can't. The world has too much information in it to be able to get by otherwise. And we get worse at being skeptical of other people as we get older, which can really suck us into sharing lots of things that turn out to be false. And then on top of that, all of us tend to be a little bit more skeptical of things that we disagree with than things that we agree with. So when somebody spouts off something about your favorite political candidate or your favorite politician, you get all up in arms and immediately run to Snopes to find out if it's true. But if they say something about the candidate you hate, you're like, yeah, that's right. And so, I think again, that is something that is hard as you get older, becomes a little bit harder to inhibit, to stop yourself from doing that. And so you end up having that stronger reaction. And the next thing you know, you forwarded that to 30 of your closest friends.
I don't feel like I'm becoming more credulous in my advancing old age. I feel like I'm becoming more skeptical. Is there some reason why we thumbed primates would do that as we become older? Why would we become more credulous?
Well, for one thing, what happens to us is it's a little bit hard for us to know exactly how credulous we are as individuals, because our memories are biased. So you will remember all of the things that somebody told you that you disagreed with and say, see, I'm skeptical, but you don't have the base rate. You don't know how many things you were exposed to. And we've got information coming at us rapid fire. So if you're exposed on social media to 75 posts and in 2 minutes, and one of those posts raises your hackles and you say, I'm skeptical of that, you think I'm being really skeptical, but 74 of those things passed into your brain without comment. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit hard to know how skeptical we're all really being. And I think it also takes energy to be skeptical. You have to actually stop what you're doing and then think about it. You have to separate yourself from the context that you're in that moment, and then bring other knowledge that you have to bear and think through it. And that's a lot of work. And at some point, you don't necessarily want to do that work. It's easier to just kind of go along with what it is that you're being told, with what it is that somebody's suggesting to you. And, just like we get tired as we get older, we don't necessarily want to walk up 12 flights of stairs. The brain is an energy hungry organ. Don't forget, it's about 3% of your body weight, uses about 20 to 25% of your daily energy supply. It's really energy hungry. So your brain doesn't necessarily want to spend a lot of time on stuff if it doesn't need to. And you make different decisions about how you want to spend that energy early and late in your life.
That's fascinating. Yeah, that's incredible. So it's almost like you're sort of standing at the plate, and when you're young and you have a lot of energy, you swing a lot at the balls, and then you just kind of watch the ball go by a little bit as you get older, probably.
Yeah, that's right. Draw a walk.
I'm wondering. I wanted to just be sure that people know that they should ask questions, or else they're just going to get a whole bunch more of questions like they're getting from me right now. So do feel free to go up to the Q&A button or the chat button. Either way, I don't really care which one you use, and ask questions, because this is a really interesting subject. So I want to ask you, because you're a guy that's been involved in this kind of work for a long time, before social media even existed. What is your social media consumption like now? What has it been like? How have you related with social media?
Yeah, I'm as bad as everybody else with it. Like everybody else, the gateway was the opportunity to connect with old friends and things like that. And I've certainly used social media on both sides of the equation, as somebody who writes blog entries for Psychology Today and Fast Company and Harvard Business Review and writes books and things like that. I'm putting stuff out there too to try and influence the statistics of people's worlds in the hope that they might buy a book like Brain Briefs or Bring Your Brain to Work. But So I've played that game on the other side, but certainly, I get sucked into seeing something from a friend and something from another friend, and then thinking, whoa, I haven't seen anything from that person in a while. I wonder what they're up to. And so certainly I feel like I have fallen into the trap, and certainly at the beginning of COVID did as much doom scrolling as anybody else on Twitter. So, just knowing about this stuff doesn't always help. Although I will say the place where it's had the biggest effect on me is I tend to buy movies and TV shows and things like that rather than watching them on commercial TV. So I do get less advertising of that sort. Although, again, as we're chatting about behind the scenes before we started, that doesn't save me from all the product placements that are embedded in all those shows.
Well, if you watch more movies on AFS at Home, our virtual cinema platform, I think you'll see very few product placements there. Just throwing that out there. That was a product placement, in fact.
One really? AFS Home. Sorry.
AFS at Home. Yes. Oh no, everybody's talking about it. I'm sure that you're hearing. We're starting to get some questions coming in, but I wanted to ask before I get to Sanford's excellent question here. There's a lot of stuff about about the sort of scientific quality of this, how dopamine is being injected into your brainstem at the particular time that you see this, and all of that. And that sort of one person in the documentary or in the film says that it's literally a drug. So I'm wondering about that aspect there. Are people getting a dopamine high, and were people getting, 70 years ago, a dopamine high from seeing a Norman Rockwell illustration in Life magazine advertising tires or something? Does that?
Yeah. So I'm gonna dig into this a little bit, because that actually was a little annoying.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a misunderstanding popularly about what dopamine does. So dopamine. So how to say this? Okay, if you were going to study what the brain does, you've got to find some sort of system to study it in, some kind, and typically what neuroscientists did early on was to study this in rats. And so what you would do is you'd have a rat perform a task, and you would measure activity in its brain. And so early on they discovered that if you got a rat to press a bar and then it got a reward, that dopamine neurons that release dopamine would fire when it got the reward. And so this became known as the reward signal, because it was correlated with the reward. That is, that these neurons fired when the rat got the reward. Now that doesn't mean that signal was inherently rewarding or that it made the rat feel good. It meant that signal was related to reward. Now, we have since started to interpret that, particularly in the popular press, as dopamine is giving you some kind of high, that it's giving you some kind of pleasure. What dopamine is really doing is signaling to your brain that you need to learn something right now. And so what you get, in fact, when you study these reward signals, what you find is that when the reward signal is unpredictable, like you press this bar and then suddenly you got a reward, you get this big dopamine signal. After it's completely predictable that you get the reward after pressing the bar, you stop getting the signal. And that's because it's not about pleasure. It's about your brain telling you there's nothing to see here anymore. You've learned everything you need to know. And so what's really happening, so dopamine matters here, but it matters not because you're getting some kind of drug high, but because what they're doing with social media is consistently putting you in a mildly unpredictable situation so that you constantly have to learn. And when you constantly have to learn, you are engaged. When things are completely predictable, you can look away. And that's why, one thing that they did say that I think is very important is that what they've done is actually early on in the history of studying learning, they would look at these, when you get a rat to press a bar, and then if you want to get a rat to press a bar forever, you don't reward it on every trial. What you do is to reward it about 40% of the time, more or less randomly. And if you do that, you'll get that rat to press the bar for an awfully long time, even after you stop rewarding it. And there are two places in the world right now where you encounter that schedule of reinforcement. One of them is in Vegas, because they explicitly program those things into the slot machine. So you literally are a rat pressing a bar in Vegas. And then social media, where they've built those same tools in there to keep you engaging with social media, even in periods in which you don't see something rewarding. So it's all about that. Dopamine is all about learning. It's all about creating attention, not because you're experiencing pleasure, but because your brain is saying there's always something new to learn here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating, that whole aspect of dopamine. So the dopamine pops in there, and is that some sort of an aid or a catalyst to forming new pathways or learning?
It's a signal that helps you to draw attention to things. It's related to the development of habits. So part of what it's doing is helping you to say, oh, do this again the next time that you encounter this. So it's really helpful for that, because, if you think about it, there's lots of behaviors that you start doing because you think about it explicitly. Like you walk into a room, and the first time you walk into that room, you're not sure where the light switch is. You look around, you find it. By the fifth or sixth time that you walk into the room, you actually just by motor memory, you know where the light switch is. You can flick it on without thinking about it. And the way that happens is that the first time you do it, you explicitly think about it, you flip the switch, the light goes on, and there's a primitive part of your brain that's surprised by that goes, whoa, I took this action and suddenly the room is bright, and you get a dopamine hit. And you do that a few times, and after a while, what you've done is to associate, make this movement, the light goes on, and now you can do that without having to think about it. And that's really what that dopamine system is doing for you.
Gotcha. So we've got I'm getting a dopamine rush from getting these great questions from some of our attendees. So let me ask, this is one from Sanford Wyatt. Sanford says, is it reasonable to believe I could moderate my exposure to social media, or do I just need to flat out quit using it? This sort of presupposes that it's a negative, I think.
Yeah, I think if you're trying to minimize your use of social media, what you have to do is not to rely on yourself. So your brain has two systems that drive action. I call them the go system and the stop system. And the go system is the one that engages goals you have, and your habits are part of that go system. So when you associate a particular environment with an action, which is what a habit does, that's part of that go system. So when you're on social media, part of what they've done is to create a bunch of habits, to scroll and to flip through things and to make comments and things like that. Once that go system is engaged, the only way to stop yourself from doing something is to engage a second system that I call the stop system, that is an effortful system to engage. It's an inhibitory system. It involves some brain areas that are a little evolutionarily newer than that go system is. And it requires, and the key thing is it requires effort. And so the problem is, if that go system really gets engaged on social media, it can be really hard to stop yourself, because you're so engaged in and engrossed in what's going on, and they're feeding you things that are going to continue to pique your interest, that it can be hard to rely on that stop system to stop you and get you doing something else. So what you need to do is to have some external system to help you out. Set a timer, get an app that will shut the program off after a few minutes, do something. Have some external thing that's going to poke you and remind you it's time to get off social media, so that you don't get sucked down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, that gets covered a bunch in the film, and people talking about not taking the phone to bed, or putting the phone in that little food safe thing, that ridiculous food safe. So that's kind of interesting. I'm wondering, we talk about the go system and all of that. I've noticed, like, when there's sounds for scrolling or sounds for hitting a button or something like that, are those sort of like more or less scientifically calibrated and developed to hook us in?
Well, what they're designed for is it's not so much that those sounds are so pleasing that I have to keep hearing that sound. It's not like an ASMR recording or something, but it's much more that those sounds become associated with actions. And so a lot of what they're trying to do is to create unique elements of social media that they can associate with actions that will keep you engaged. So the sound of a message coming in now becomes associated with the action of clicking, wherever it is on the upper part of the screen to get to your messages and to check those out. The sound of someone typing a comment gets you to stare at that so that you wait, with bated breath to see what they have to say. So that's what those sounds are doing, is creating opportunities to become associated with something that makes you want to stick around a little bit longer.
We have a good question from Danny here, who says, the film really harps on how social media is slowly leading to societal destruction. Boy, does it. How should we balance our urgency on the issues of social media? And are there any ways in which social media affects us that you think is undercovered by the media or by the film, or just generally people are unaware of?
Yeah, well, as I say, this is a little bit of reefer madness here, right? I mean, it's in the grand scheme of things, social media is probably not the biggest threat to humanity. I think that we do need to be aware that it influences our opinions about things, and that it is biasing what we think is normal by influencing how many people we think agree with us, which can affect our beliefs. But if social media is not the only way that you're getting information, then you're being exposed to some other things, and there probably are bigger problems in the world than that. So, what I would say is, as my parents always said, right, everything in moderation. I think that we have to really put this into context. And honestly, every technology has been put forth as the harbinger of doom. I mean, really, there really were people who said when the printing press came out, that's it. Nobody's gonna have memory anymore. Now we think books are amazing. And so, but then it was TV. TV was going to rot our brains. Turns out, maybe not so much. So I think it's social media is not inherently evil, but we do have to recognize it can have some negative qualities, and that the people who created social media are not your friends. Their goals are not your goals. And I think that one of the things about social media that was useful to point out, though maybe not over and over and over again, is that these are money-making enterprises in which your brain is the product. And so you really do want to be aware that the people who are developing the tool aren't just trying to connect you up with old friends. They're trying to get you to look at their product as often as possible. And so if that's not your goal, you're going to want to make sure that you have a little bit more agency in determining how you spend your time.
I'm wondering, I want to get some more questions from some of our folks who are joining us in a moment. And we have even more attendees that are joining us, so please feel free to jump into the chat bar and the Q&A bar. But what do you think, because you're someone who's studied all this kind of stuff, what do you think that, say, some of the old time Madison Avenue or like David Ogilvy or the Mad Men from an earlier era, what do you think they would have thought about Facebook's model?
That's a great question. My guess is that there'd be sort of a mix, right? Of on the one hand, a lot of the advertising is not that nifty, right? I mean, there were some really cool ad campaigns back in the day, right? And jingle writers, some of the jingle writers are brilliant, right? And I think there's a little bit less of that creativity going on, but actually the active ingredient in most ads is just staring at the brand logo more than anything else. So really, I think what's happened is social media has managed to distill advertising to its essence and then target it directly at the people who are most likely to be swayed by it. And so I think the Mad Men would probably have a little bit of disdain as they sip their end of day whiskey at the fact that these people aren't nearly as creative as we are, but also some envy that they're able to do something that in the 1960s just would have been undreamable.
Yeah, definitely. It's an entirely just different kind of world. We have a question from I can't believe I'm meeting a real Schildkraut, Debbie Keston Schildkraut. I love that name. Who asks one of the dangers with social media that we've seen. One of the dangers is the proliferating of the QAnon conspiracy beliefs. How do people get stuck on these groups, and how do you get people out of these groups?
Well, we've had cults of various kinds for forever, right? I mean, people are looking for salvation. They're looking for explanations for the complexity of the world, and I think that QAnon just manages to bring it to an awful lot of people in real time. It's the world is a complicated place, and it's really hard to understand and predict what's going on, and most of us feel better about life when we have a little bit of an explanation for why things happen. So if you think about watching the news cycle, when a tragedy happens, I mean, and sadly we've had some mass shootings in the last several days as examples. When a shooting like that happens, there's a brief bit of reporting of what happened, and then there's continual news coverage for the next couple of days, not on what happened, but on why it happened. Speculation, data, information from interviews, and then discussions about the why component, and the why not just of the statements that a perpetrator may have made, but also societal factors. So we want explanations, and we really want explanations for things that we think are unpredictable, because the brain is fundamentally a prediction engine. We want to be able to predict the world. We feel better about the world when we can predict what's going on. Now, take something really complicated like our political environment. The more that you feel unsettled, and the more that you feel like our political world is unpredictable, the more that you begin to look for some reason why things act the way they do. And one of the things that QAnon really has provided is this elaborate structure that says there's this deep state, there are these actors who are behind the scenes really pulling all the strings that are making things happen, which in a weird way provides a comfort that the world is actually more rational and more predictable than you might think it is. And you combine that with the ability to be part of an elite community. And that's the other thing that's being sold here is, not everybody knows what's going on, but if you're part of the group, you are in the know. You actually understand things at a level that's deeper than everybody else does. And that combination is powerful. And let's face it, we do this in all sorts of ways. I mean, think about, I mean, academia is a club that's not too dissimilar from QAnon in some ways, right? It's a whole bunch of people who walk around saying, I know stuff you don't know, and that makes me feel better about the world and better about myself. And yet, I get laughed at occasionally, but I don't necessarily, I'm willingly lumping myself in with QAnon somehow. But it's, but I think lots of us belong to communities that have that kind of quality to it. Some of them just, have kind of gone off the rails a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's so interesting, is that there is sort of people who feel like they have nothing. Want to feel like that they're part of this elite that's wearing the It's Alive glasses and are really seeing everything as it is. It sort of makes them feel a lot more special than if they were just, changing tires in West Virginia.
Well, look, there's hundreds of millions of people in this country, right? It's easy to feel lost, and so to feel like I'm part of an elite is kind of nice in a world in which most of us are not really part of an elite.
You are part of an elite. You have more education than most of us will ever have. You know so much more. So you've studied all of this, we've had the time to do that far more than most of us has. Do you kind of walk around and feel like you're seeing with X-ray, seeing culture with X-ray vision, or are you kind of swept away? Are you part of it too?
Oh, I think it would be foolish to say that I see through everything. I think in part because one of the things that psychology teaches us is how unreliable we are at understanding our own behavior. Right? I mean, think just as a great example about multitasking. For years, people would say, I'm a great multitasker. And the only thing you could do was to actually test them on something, right? So like have somebody try to text on the phone while they were driving in a controlled course so that you could demonstrate how many pylons they ran over, right? So we are unreliable sources of judgment about how good we are. So, I would say, I certainly notice some stuff other people don't because of what I've studied, but I don't think that actually protects me in any significant way. I got to try to be as skeptical as everybody else.
Yeah. Our good friend Kevin asked us how the interaction with social media goes about affecting people's critical thinking skills. Does it help?
Well, it's a tool, and any tool can help or hurt, depending on how you use it. What I would say with social media is that it exposes you to a lot of information, which gives you an opportunity to learn some things and an opportunity to try to exercise some critical thinking skills and to make decisions about what are the reliable sources of information I might want to check things against when I hear something, and so I can learn to engage in ways that allow me to think critically. But social media doesn't promote it. And it doesn't promote it for a couple of reasons. One, because a huge amount of information is coming at you at any given moment, and that doesn't give you much time. One of the things that you require for critical thinking is time. You got to slow down and spend time thinking about things and considering multiple sources. Also, social media tends to promote hot takes, right? There are very few carefully reasoned comments on a Facebook post. And most Twitter threads are not really, 280 characters is not a medium that screams out, this is a dissertation. And so, they don't even have an edit button, for crying out loud, on Twitter, right? So none of those things are really conducive to think this through really carefully and then make a reasoned argument. And critical thinking actually does require that. Critical thinking requires not just skepticism, but thought, taking a step back. And the problem is with something that irked you on social media, even if you do go back and think about it, by the time you actually have the idea, that the carefully reasoned idea you want to throw into the comments section, it's like 4 days later and no one's going to see it. So you don't bother.
Which leads to that terrible phenomenon where sometimes we tweet or we reply in a comment and it's brilliant. It's brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. And we don't get our credit. We don't get our just likes. Oh, I'm so angry. We're reaching a point where we're winding down our discussion here. But I wanted to ask you, what social media do you use most? I mean, there's using social media for promoting your many endeavors, certainly, but what is this? Is there one social media avenue that you particularly get a lot out of?
I tend to take a quick scroll through my Twitter feed periodically just to see what kinds of issues people are throwing out there. I don't follow a lot of people. I've got about 500 people I follow, and they're a mix of mainstream media figures, psychologists, and colleagues at the university. And so it just gives me a flavor of some of the things that are going on in those communities, which I find interesting. Although again, I think like everybody else, I got a little bit too into doom scrolling at the front end of COVID. I do like to look at Facebook to see what friends are doing. I mean, I will say, look, I had dinner last week or 2 weeks ago now with my college roommate, who I hadn't seen in 30 years, who's RVing across the country with his wife, who knew that I was here because we're both on social media together. Mm-hmm. And that was pretty cool, honestly. And then 2 days later, had a conversation with a high school friend that I hadn't talked to in just about as long, because I'm on social media. I posted some stuff he read, and he wanted to talk about it. Again, that's really that is cool, and was something that 30 years ago was unavailable. 30 years ago, you just lost touch with everybody, and now you know, the only thing it's done is it's made high school reunions less appealing because you've been seeing everybody anyhow. So I don't know. I mean, I kind of like that. And then I use LinkedIn, which I find interesting, just to see, because I study things related to the business world in some of my work. It's interesting for me to see what trends are out there, what kinds of things are the concerns that people have, because it can be really hard to see, when people are, LinkedIn will show you when a lot of people gone out of work, for example, and that's just, it's useful to know, right? Because I think there are trends you see there that you see way before they get picked up by mainstream media.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It hadn't occurred to me. One thing about, they think I'm a computer programmer rather than a film programmer, which is very interesting. So I get an unusual sort of interest. I wanted to ask, you've been so kind with your time, and we're wrapping it up, but since we've mentioned this word a couple of times, I feel like we should have a definitive idea about what is doom scrolling and why do we do it? Because we know it, I think we all know what it is. You're just like aimlessly kind of going through and looking for that piece of information that you don't even know what it is. What do you think doom scrolling is? Why do we do this?
Yeah, so doom scrolling is something that we do when there is an event or a situation that is one of these unpredictable situations. And one of the ways that I've talked about this before is there are certain situations in your life that cause a tear in the fabric of your life story. Some of those events are personal events, the death of a loved one, the breakup of a relationship, things like that. But some of them are public events. The start of the COVID pandemic, the 9/11, things like that. For me, the explosion of the space shuttle Challenger. These are just these unexpected events, and when those happen, you want to feel like you understand what happened, and you want a source of information. And social media provides that, because there's all sorts of people who are posting and tweeting about the event, and they have different approaches to it. They're drawing from different media sources. They are having different conversations about it. And so part of what you end up doing is just looking at all of these different takes on it. And what you're doing is really mourning the life that you had prior to the event, and creating a story for yourself that allows you to reweave that narrative back together, so that this unpredictable, surprising, difficult event now fits somehow into your life story. And so if you think about it, last March, it was pretty chaotic. It was, it's like, what? They canceled South by? What? I have to work from home? What? I could get sick just by touching something, and so it was chaos. Now we look back on it and we're like, yeah, so there was this pandemic and we heard about it and nobody quite knew what to do, but then suddenly we all went home and everything was fine. And we have a whole story we can tell about it now, so it doesn't bug us as much, because, and that is in part the kind of psychological benefit of having gone through that whole process of reading all that stuff and feeling like, oh, I'm not alone in feeling chaos like this. But I'll bet if you had a social media time machine, and you could go to your social media account now and get the feed from a year ago, you would look at it and go, why was I so interested in this? It's not as fascinating anymore. It actually, as an analogy, years ago, when my oldest son was like 4 months old, he was learning to turn over. And I never turned over before, and he was just about to do it. And I put a video camera on him for like 35 minutes. And then he finally turned over. And I was so excited by this. And when he was maybe 10, I went back through all these old videos and I saw this video of Lucas turning over for the first time. So I thought, well, I'll watch this. And like 3 minutes in, I'm like, what was I doing? But it was riveting at the time because it had this kind of unpredictable, joyous meaning. And that's that sort of joy scrolling, but it's the same idea. Right. And in retrospect, you think, what in the world was I spending time on? But there is actually a psychological benefit to it.
Well, I mean, I feel like if it is therapeutic, I remember the Challenger explosion very well. I mean, it's seared into my brain from when I was a kid, and there was nothing to do. It felt like there was nowhere to go, nowhere to really talk to. The teachers didn't know what to say.
Yeah.
Nobody
and
knew
they didn't want
to
to talk about it.
Yeah.
They should have talked about it, right? Everyone should have just talked about it.
Yeah. So it's possible now that with doom scrolling, it's like we're able to go through, and most of the ones that you're going past aren't really giving you anything, but 1 in 100 gives you something, and allows you to kind of move on. I'm so glad we asked that question, because that's a hell of a thing, which I never thought about. This has been so fascinating. I'm wondering, for people that are kind of lit up right now and thinking about all of these things, where would you point them in terms of maybe work that you're a part of, books that you've written, podcasts that you've done, for them to go and listen to or read?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great psychology content out there these days. I'm gonna skip pointing people to social media because that just seems like the wrong thing to do right now. I've written a few books. I've got one called Smart Thinking that's on effective thinking. Another one called Smart Change on behavior change. My most recent one is Bring Your Brain to Work. Did one called Brain Briefs, which I did with my buddy Bob Duke, who's my co-host on our show, Two Guys on Your Head. Got to give a shout out to Rebecca McEnroy, our amazing producer, without whom, as we like to say, without whom there would be no guys. And so that's that show's been a blast. And if you've never heard it before, the reason that I like to recommend it is because it's only 7.5 minutes long. So it's not a huge investment. You can listen to it and walk by it if it doesn't appeal. But I want to point out that there is just a lot of great psychology content out there. There are a lot of great psychologists who've written books that are well worth reading. Actually, in the movie, Jonathan Haidt is an author who's written several really great books. A lot of good psychologists out there. And what I'll say is, if you want to vet whether you should read a book, err on the side of reading some of these books by the scientists rather than by the reporters who write about this stuff secondhand, because they tend to get the details wrong. There's something about speaking the research like a native that even if we're not quite as brilliant a writer as some of the reporters are, at least we get the details right.
Excellent advice. I'd say that's true for film programmers too. Just go right to the film programmer. Thank you so much, Art. I'll call you Art.
Oh, absolutely.
Since we're friends now.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to I think that at our peak we were at 27 people that tuned in to this. We're at 24 now. So thanks for everybody who joined us. This has been a blast. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to buying you a beer or whatever you like when we're back at the AFS Cinema sometime this summer. So thank you all for being here, and signing off. Drive carefully, and rock on.